So until 2 weeks ago, I had managed to avoid Project X for the best part of 9 years, and now here I am about to read more into it than anyone ought to. To be honest, I don't know how I've not seen this thing before, and going into it, my expectations were not high. Teen movies fantasizing about parties, booze, and girls were all about when I was a teenager, and I was never particularly enamored by any of them. And to that extent, I'm pretty sure I would have hated Project X had I actually watched it back in its release year of 2012. Now, however, dear fucking lord, where to begin? I am fully convinced that Project X is a full-on cultural artifact that is just endlessly readable, all at once serving as an incredible summation of the way that teenhoods and millennials and even Gen Z to an extent were regulated and managed by society, an unimpeded exploration of the male gaze and how much Hollywood utilized it from studio to screen in the 2000s and early 2010s, and being the definition of our worship of the American high school experience, and how films like this allow us to rewrite our own experiences and continue to vicariously live them for years after. There's also the ending, which honestly had me speechless for some really quite dark reasons that I'll get onto later on in the video. The short of it is that Project X is not just a teen party movie, much as it is quite incredible at being that, and what it achieves as a piece of media is simply astonishing. Hey guys, how's it going? My name's Munro, and in today's video, we're talking about the 2012 film Project X. Let me just clear up a few things before we jump head on into this. Project X is a vulgar, crass, hedonistic film that is just everything that I criticize in most other movies. The constant shots of boobs and bums, the endless use of bitch as a slur, as well as plenty of other choice words, the sexism that just seeps through every crack of this thing, yikes! I do not approve of this being displayed in the positive light whatsoever, but I do think that in being so extreme in these aspects, the film serves as a really quite unrivaled text that captures the culture of the time. That capturing does not exclude its offences, but it does make the film an incredible thing to analyse. Speaking of which, let's jump in and explore this, and a word of warning, there will be spoilers throughout. Let's start with the teenager-authority relationships in this film. I'm not sure there's ever been a party film, or even party scene for that matter, involving teenagers in film and TV that has not had some take on the parents telling the kids not to party trope. Parties, of course, are treated as a rite of passage both in media and in real life, so I wasn't surprised when this film rolled out its version of this within the opening moments. Where Project X differs, however, is in how it uses the parents and the other authority figures that it pulls in. There's Rob, the neighbour, written to play as the generic suburban dad, the police force who are always on hand, and of course the drug dealer and flamethrower wielder T-Rick. This combination of characters is in no way radical, but against how the film portrays modern teenagers, they become antagonists relevant to the experiences of a lot of young people. And almost all of that comes from the partying in this film, whereas so many other party scenes or party narratives always want to hinge it around jocks being dicks, friends having fights, someone breaking something or whatever. Project X treats all of these tropes as mere side stories. The main focus on so many of the shots and segments is entirely on people partying and expressing themselves. That sequence with the A-track remix of Heads Will Roll was easily my favourite moment of the whole film, mainly because it just captures how that song makes me feel. Much as there is plenty of misogyny in the shot choices, especially when they glorify women's bodies, which we'll cover in the next segment, there was also so much diversity in the people that were there. The crowds end up blending into one another, which has a quite equalizing and unifying effect. With so much control of teenagers' lives coming from school, which for the last few decades has put excessive emphasis on preparing teens for university and their future careers, must also grow up in a world where social status is increasingly controlled by social media. That equalization is a really positive thing, and the threats of this equalization come from those antagonistic characters. Thomas's parents, who won't stop ringing him, represent the helicopter parenting so common for people who grew up in the 90s and 2000s. Rob the neighbour represents the ideal of the peaceful suburban neighbourhood, where the message they pretend to embody of making it nice for everyone is really just a way to make themselves feel bigger than others and shovel their own grievances onto other people. The police follow a similar kind of trend, representing society's push to keep order, which actually ends up limiting these freedoms. And T-Rick? Well, maybe that contradicts my point, given that I was taught in school not to mess with drug dealers, and look what happened with this lot. The point is that all this excess and freedom that is put on screen is a total rejection of the standards that the antagonists embody. That's certainly not a new idea for teen content, but given that this was made in 2012, coming decade after decade of increased police presence in the US and a reshaping of suburbia in the eyes of these older generations keen to swat down any of these threats to its fake peace, it's almost like the party is a consequence of all of that. If there's one thing that this film succeeds at more than anything else, it's in representing the unending misogyny that has surrounded the lives of teenage boys for years. Let's put it this way, I went to an all-boys secondary school, and the way that Project X's main character spoke was uncanny. There is far too much to go into for one video to explain why teenage boys just intrinsically grow up surrounded by so much misogyny. But there was a reliable source for it for a very long time, and that was Hollywood. So many films in the 2000s and early 2010s that were marketed towards male audiences relied on misogynistic tropes and almost always glorified these attitudes. It's no surprise, therefore, that Todd Phillips produced this, with his work including the Hangover trilogy. These sort of films always feel to me like they're there to reassure these men who have these incredibly outdated views that it's okay to still think like this and be a complete fucking dirge to society. Project X barely contains a shot that doesn't reinforce the male gaze, that is, the view and the depicting of women in the eye of these negative masculine and heterosexual stereotypes, almost always treating women as objects of sexual pursuit. From within 10 minutes into this film, the main three characters are objectifying women, and they go on to treat all sorts of things as sex objects and use all manner of derogatory and very offensive language. Meanwhile, women just take off their bras when going into the swimming pool just because they're asked. They lift up their tops on request and lick people's necks when flirting with them. I mean, the list goes on. All of this comes with very, very little development of any of the female characters, with even Kirby being nothing more than a love interest for Thomas. And yet, the gratuity with which this film just indulges in the male gaze is in itself a selling point, because where better to look to see just how fundamental it was to making these sorts of films at the time. So extreme is its presence here that you could happily draw an extensive case study into just how deep it went into the creation of these films, as well as how these teen-oriented ones help set up audiences for life to consume this sort of stuff. I find it telling that this film rightly gets an 18 rating, when it's likely that a lot of its viewers have been younger than that, and no doubt that is something that the producers were considering when they made it. Much as we still have so far to go in addressing the male gaze in media, the extremity in Project X makes it an apt anchor point to represent how far we have come since its release. Just look at the party scenes in newer films that make up much of Booksmart or Love, Simon. Both are so much healthier in terms of their depictions. For that reason, I feel that this thing just has such huge value for study in terms of showing sexism and misogyny on screen. Where Project X really goes all out is in its glorification of the high school experience. This too is something that the film industry loves to market to audiences, and it's one that hits a particularly personal point for many. The obsession with youth and holding your experience of it above all else, it just seems to be such a common trait these days. Hollywood would honestly have you believe that if you didn't have the perfect teenhood or the perfect grown-up experience as depicted in its movies, that society will just reject you. And it does this because it needs to be able to sell films like this, that take the American high school experience and glorify it into a fantasy. The allure of the American high school experience, with its extensive tropes, character types, and innate appeal to a wide part of society, is an intoxicating one, and I feel that it's treated as the standard for any film or TV show that wants to have parts of itself set in school. This is not a totally overpowering force within media. Over here in the UK, we have a strong, long-running archetype for stories set in British schools, especially in TV shows. But even we can't resist the allure of the American version, both in terms of being big consumers of this sort of media and even adopting tropes of it into British set shows. And the medias that employ the American high school experience almost always worship it. Even with the enormous social and developmental issues that it creates for people in real life, perhaps best shown in Project X via the dorky social outsider standing of its three main characters, its use in media almost always finds a way to end up portraying it as a positive. Our trio finds social success and acceptance in throwing this party, and that in itself is a narrative outcome found in tons of films and shows like this. High school parties are posited as this moment of unlimited potential freedom where everything and anything is possible, gleefully ignoring the realities. There's nothing wrong in painting over these cracks, of course. Films are supposed to be entertaining at the end of the day, but for the audience, I feel that there's a sadder side to this, because in glorifying the high school experience, the film ends up encouraging us to compare ourselves to it. For those younger than high school age, Project X ends up looking like a goal or aspiration that will bring them validation that they might be looking for. Whilst for older audiences who have already gone past this age, it ends up going one of two ways. Either it paints you out to be lesser than the characters for not having had the same high school experience like this, or on the flip side, it allows you to vicariously keep living in this time period and pretend that your high school experience was just as good as this. The sheer amount of media that uses this as a narrative feature means that it has become a de facto standard that is put on this pedestal, one which the film gives you no opportunity to separate yourself from. If you get enjoyment out of this, do not let me stop you, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that Project X isn't an insanely entertaining film to watch. But the excess that it throws out is distorting, and it has unintended negative consequences for the audience. So now we come to the final scene, which, as I mentioned before, left me pretty much speechless. This for me is really where the film made its most remarkable point. There is a sequence in the final 20 or so minutes of the film where the party goes from getting out of hand to looking like a war zone. The police come in to shut things down as it spills onto the street, only to be pushed back by the partygoers, who in turn are then confronted with T-Rick, armed with a flamethrower and demanding he gets his gnome back. Violence ensues as the house and neighbourhood are torched, and the crowds are forced to flee in the middle of an armed response from the police, who fire flashbangs and rubber bullets. At face value, this is a wild and thrilling finale that certainly suits the tone of the film, but I think it goes a hell of a lot deeper than just that. So much of the film is tackling the teenage experience in the modern United States, and the United States is a country intrinsically entwined with violence. The country exports and marginalizes violence both on home soil and abroad. Whether it be through its military, through its policing, or through its gun laws, violence is intrinsically related to the American experience, and as a result, its society has developed some amazing ways to deal with it. The exporting and marginalizing that I talk about is in how dismissive it is of the impact that it creates. Violence is always happening over there, and most usually over there is the Middle East or Asia. If it is violence on home soil, then it's always happening in another city or a different neighborhood. That line towards the end of the film where the neighbors were interviewed by the news saying,
"You moved to a place like Pasadena to avoid stuff like this,"
is a prime example of what I'm talking about. The need to believe in creating a perfect suburban existence for these people and then to control it means that they have become masters of avoiding actually confronting its consequences. So to have thousands of teenagers running through flames and dodging flashbangs is a metaphor for the victims of this avoidance. This is a society that feels the need to protect children from everything from the internet to Kinder eggs to sex to immigrants to transgender people, and yet it's those kids that end up being caught in the crossfire for wanting to forge their own path. You need only look at the Black Lives Matter protests from last summer to see this in action, where the police were firing tear gas on teenagers. The fact that this is the consequence of the wild party that precedes it in Project X was exactly why I was left so speechless, and I've not yet come across any other media that has been able to explore this connection in quite the way that it does here. And I think that's quite enough reading into it for today. Project X is most certainly a film that deserves to be criticised for its portrayals of excess and the endless amounts of sexism that it puts on screen, but to read it as only that, I think is doing it a huge disservice. This thing is a true time capsule into the world of the early 2010s, both in terms of its culture and in terms of the media that helped to contribute to it. And even if you don't read all into this when you watch it, there's a lot of value to be drawn from the nostalgia of this thing. The music was stunning, save for the D12 track that actively promotes rape. The fashion was spot on, the haircuts were spot on, the MacBook that just suddenly appears on the DJ decks was spot on. It's a good time so long as you're fully prepared for its language and misogyny. I'd love to know if you also had any equally deep thoughts. Drop them in the comments and I'll have a read of them. If you want a little bit more early 2010s nostalgia, you can go and check out my video on Skrillex, where I explored the EDM scene of the time and its power as a sort of form of nostalgia. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you're keeping well, and I'll catch you in the next one. Outfit check, baby. Today we're rocking a brand new black vintage hoodie. I've been in the market for one of these for so long now, and I finally found the one that I've been searching for endlessly on thousands of eBay pages and Depop and all sorts of other sites. It's like some sort of American racing hoodie. There's a whole fucking thing on the back as well that you can see. I've not worked out what series this is at all. I'm quite knowledgeable when it comes to motorsport, and even in terms of the American stuff, I'm not sure what this is. Also, my vaccine today. Fucking stoked about it, honestly. If you haven't got yours, I hope you're either getting yours soon or you accept it and that you do get it. Hashtag Pfizer gang. I hope are you able to get Pfizer where you are or something? I don't know. That sounds cool. Look at that.